You know, there's a particular kind of silence that descends when you finally stop, when you stop performing, stop pretending, stop maintaining the fiction of who you've been trying to be. And this silence, this emptiness, it's not what you expected. You thought that being authentic would feel like relief, like coming home, like finally being yourself. And maybe eventually it does. But first, it feels like nothing, like absence, like a vast, echoing space where something used to be. This is disturbing because you've spent so long building this version of yourself, maintaining this presentation, keeping up this act, that when it falls away, you're left with what? Who are you without the performance? What's there when you're not pretending anymore? Let me ask you something. Have you noticed that when you stop trying to be impressive, you don't immediately feel authentic, you just feel boring? That when you stop performing confidence, you don't feel genuine, you feel uncertain? That when you drop the mask, there's not a clear, defined face underneath, there's just confusion about what your actual face even looks like? This is the strange emptiness. And nobody warns you about it. They tell you to be yourself, as if yourself is a clear, obvious, readily accessible thing, as if you just stop pretending and there you are, fully formed, authentic, present. But it's not like that at all. When you stop pretending, there's often a disturbing blankness, a sense of not knowing who you are, or what you want, or what you actually feel when you're not performing feeling. This emptiness is terrifying, because it suggests that maybe there was no real you underneath the performance. Maybe you are the performance. Maybe all those years of pretending created a hollow shell. And when you look inside for the authentic self, everyone keeps talking about there's nothing there, just empty space, just absence, just the echo of all the roles you've played without any actor behind them. And so you panic. You want to rush back into the performance because at least the performance felt like something. At least when you were pretending, you had a sense of who you were, even if it wasn't real. At least the character had clear motivations and defined traits and a coherent story. This emptiness has none of that. This emptiness is just empty. But here's what I want you to understand. This emptiness is not a problem. It's not evidence that you're hollow or fake or that there's no real you. This emptiness is space. It's the space that's been cleared by removing all the pretending. It's the blank canvas that appears when you erase the painting you've been maintaining. It's the silence that emerges when you stop making noise. And this space, as uncomfortable as it is, as frightening as it feels, is actually necessary. Because you can't discover who you actually are while you're still performing who you think you should be. You can't find your authentic self while you're still cluttered with the pretend self. You can't hear your real voice while you're still speaking in the voice you've been using to be acceptable. The emptiness is not the destination. It's the transition. It's the gap between who you were pretending to be and who you actually are. It's the space where discovery becomes possible. But first, you have to be willing to sit in the emptiness, to be with the nothing, to tolerate the absence without rushing to fill it with another performance. Let me tell you what the pretending looked like. Maybe you pretended to be more confident than you were. You walked into rooms with your shoulders back and your voice steady and your opinions clear, even when inside you felt small and uncertain and didn't know what you thought about anything. The confident persona became so practiced that you could maintain it without thinking. It was just how you showed up. Or maybe you pretended to be more easygoing than you were. You went along with plans you didn't like, ate at restaurants you didn't enjoy, laughed at jokes you didn't find funny, agreed with opinions you didn't share. The agreeable persona was so automatic that you stopped noticing when you were suppressing your actual preferences. You just became the person who goes with the flow. Or maybe you pretended to be more successful than you were. You curated your social media, edited your stories, highlighted the achievements and hid the struggles. You presented a life that looked enviable, exciting, impressive. The successful persona required constant maintenance, but it got you admiration, so you kept it up. Or maybe you pretended to be more together than you were. You kept your home perfect, your appearance polished, your life organized. You never let anyone see the mess, the chaos, the moments when you were barely holding it together. The competent persona was exhausting, but it felt better than being seen as a disaster. Or maybe you pretended to be more independent than you were. You handled everything alone, asked for nothing, needed no one. You projected strength and self-sufficiency even when you were lonely and overwhelmed and desperately wanted help. The independent persona protected you from vulnerability, from being a burden, from depending on anyone who might let you down. Whatever your particular brand of pretending, it served a purpose. It protected you. It got you acceptance, admiration, love, belonging. It helped you navigate a world that punished certain kinds of authenticity and rewarded certain kinds of performance. It wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't stupid. It was adaptive. It made sense given what you needed and what the world demanded. But then something shifted. Maybe you got tired. Maybe the effort of maintaining the performance became too much. Maybe you started to realize that the acceptance you were getting wasn't real because the person being accepted wasn't real. Maybe you had a crisis, or a breakdown, or a moment of clarity that made you question the whole production. And you decided to stop, to just stop pretending, to drop the act and show up as you actually are. And that's when you discover the emptiness. Because when you stop pretending to be confident, you discover you don't actually know how confident you are. The pretend confidence was clear, looked like walking tall, speaking firmly, making decisions quickly. But your actual relationship to confidence is much more ambiguous. Sometimes you feel sure, sometimes uncertain. Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're bold, sometimes you're tentative. There's no clear, stable state of confidence that you can point to and say, that's the real me. When you stop pretending to be easygoing, you discover you don't actually know what your preferences are. You've been suppressing them for so long that you've lost touch with them. Someone asks where you want to eat, and you genuinely don't know. Not because you don't care, but because you've trained yourself not to access your preferences. You've trained yourself to be whatever works for others. And now when you try to check in with what you actually want, there's just blankness, emptiness, where your desires should be. When you stop pretending to be successful, you discover you don't actually know what success means to you. The pretend success was defined by external markers: money, status, recognition, achievement. But when you strip those away and ask what you actually value, what actually matters to you, what actually constitutes a life well lived, you find confusion, uncertainty, a void where you thought clarity would be. When you stop pretending to be together, you discover you don't actually know what your baseline is. Is the messiness a temporary state, or is this just how you are? Is the chaos a problem to fix or a feature to accept? Is being together even something you want, or was that just performing for an imagined audience who required it? When you stop pretending to be independent, you discover you don't actually know what healthy dependence looks like, because you've only experienced two states: complete self-sufficiency or complete dependence. You don't know how to need people in measured ways, how to ask for help sometimes, but not always, how to be both autonomous and connected, how to depend on others without losing yourself. So there's this emptiness, this not knowing, this absence, where you expected to find a clear, authentic self. And it's disorienting. It's frightening. It makes you doubt whether stopping the pretending was the right choice. But here's what's actually happening. The emptiness is not absence of self. It's absence of the false certainties that the pretending provided. The performance gave you a script. It told you how to act, what to say, what to feel, who to be. It was limiting, yes, but it was also orienting. It gave you something to hold on to, something to be. When you drop the performance, you lose that orientation. You lose the script. You lose the clear definition of who you are. And yes, that creates emptiness. But that emptiness is actually potential. It's space for something real to emerge. It's possibility. It's freedom from the constraints of the character you were playing. The authentic self is not a fixed thing that's been hiding underneath the performance waiting to be revealed. The authentic self is something you discover moment by moment by paying attention to what's actually true right now. Not what should be true, not what you want to be true, not what would be impressive or acceptable or admirable if it were true, but what actually is. And most of the time, what actually is complicated, ambiguous, contradictory, not impressive, not particularly coherent, not easily summarized. It's a flowing, changing, moment-to-moment experience that doesn't fit into a neat character description. You're confident in some situations and not in others. You have preferences about some things and genuine indifference about others. You're successful by some measures and failing by others. You're together in some areas and a mess in others. You're independent in some ways and needful in others. This is who you actually are, this complex, contradictory, ever-changing being who doesn't fit neatly into any single characterization. And discovering this is what fills the emptiness. Not with a new character, not with a better performance, but with actual presence, actual awareness, actual aliveness. But you have to be willing to sit in the emptiness first. You have to tolerate not knowing who you are. You have to resist the urge to immediately fill the space with a new performance, a new character, a new set of certainties about who you are and how you show up. Let me tell you what happens in the emptiness. At first, there's panic. The absence of definition feels like an absence of self. You look for yourself and can't find anything solid, anything clear, anything you can point to and say, that's me. And this is terrifying because we're taught that we should know who we are, that we should have a clear sense of self, that identity should be stable and defined and obvious. But when you sit with the emptiness instead of running from it, when you breathe into the not knowing instead of rushing to fill it with new certainties, something starts to happen. You start to notice things, small things, true things, things that aren't performances because they're too subtle, too fleeting, too particular to be part of any act. You notice that you actually do have a preference about the temperature of the room. You're cold. That's true. It's not impressive. It's not significant. But it's real. It's something actually happening in your actual experience right now. And because you're not performing, you can notice it. You can acknowledge it. You can even do something about it. You notice that you're irritated by a particular sound. Again, not impressive, not meaningful, not part of any character arc, but true. Actually present in your actual experience. And by noticing it, by allowing it to be real, you're starting to inhabit yourself rather than performing yourself. You notice that you're drawn to a particular color, a particular texture, a particular kind of light. These tiny preferences that never made it into the performance because they weren't significant enough, weren't impressive enough, weren't part of the character you were playing. But they're you, actually you, the you that exists in the details, in the small moments, in the immediate experience of being alive. And as you keep noticing these small, true things, the emptiness starts to fill. Not with a character, not with a performance, not with a new, improved version of the pretending, but with presence, with awareness, with the accumulating evidence of what's actually true in your actual experience. You start to develop a relationship with yourself that's based on observation rather than invention. Instead of deciding who you are and then trying to be that, you notice who you're being moment to moment. You watch yourself, not to judge, not to change, not to improve, just to know, just to see what's actually true. And this is subtle work. This is patient work. This is work that happens over time, not in a moment of revelation. Because the authentic self is not something you discover once and then possess forever. It's something you discover continuously, moment by moment, by staying present to what's actually happening in your experience. Let me tell you about the stages of this process. First, there's the stopping, the decision to quit the performance. This is usually prompted by exhaustion or crisis or a moment of clarity. It's the moment you say, I can't do this anymore, or this isn't working, or I don't even know who I am anymore. This is the moment of courage, of willingness to step off the stage. Then there's the emptiness, the disorienting absence of the familiar character, the not knowing, the blank space where the performance used to be. This is the stage most people can't tolerate. This is where they panic and either rush back to the old performance or quickly adopt a new one. But if you can stay here, if you can tolerate the emptiness, the next stage becomes possible. Then there's the noticing, the beginning of paying attention to what's actually true, the small observations, the subtle awarenesses, the accumulation of real data about who you are when you're not performing. This stage is quiet. It's undramatic. It doesn't feel like anything is happening. But this is where the real work is being done. Then there's the trusting, the gradual development of confidence that you can navigate life without the performance, that you don't need a script, that you can show up as you actually are, complex and contradictory and ever-changing, and be okay. This stage takes time. It requires repeated experiences of showing up authentically and surviving, of being real and being received, of dropping the mask and not being destroyed. And finally, there's the integration, where being authentic stops feeling like a practice and starts feeling like a way of life, where you're no longer consciously choosing authenticity, you're just being, where the emptiness has been filled not with a new character, but with presence, with awareness, with the ongoing discovery of who you are moment by moment. But here's the thing about integration. You don't arrive at a final, fixed, authentic self. You don't complete the journey and then possess your true identity forever, because there is no fixed, authentic self. There's just this ongoing process of showing up, noticing what's true, adjusting to what you discover, showing up again. The person you are is not static. It's not a thing to be discovered once and for all. It's a process, a becoming, a continuous emergence. And the emptiness you felt when you first stopped pretending, that's not something that gets permanently filled. That's the space where the emerging happens. That's the openness that allows you to be different in different moments, to grow, to change, to be alive rather than fixed. Let me tell you what people get wrong about authenticity. They think it's about discovering their true self and then being that consistently. They think there's a real them underneath all the pretending, and if they can just find that real self and express it, they'll be authentic. But this is still a form of performance. It's just performing your discovered authentic self instead of performing a fake self. Real authenticity is not about being consistently yourself. It's about being presently yourself. It's about showing up in each moment without a predetermined script, without a fixed character, without a settled identity that you're trying to maintain. It's about being responsive to what's actually happening rather than committed to a particular way of being. This means you might be confident in one moment and uncertain in the next. You might be extroverted at one gathering and want to leave early at the next. You might hold one opinion today and a different one tomorrow as you learn more. You might need connection now and space later. And all of this is authentic because it's what's true in each moment rather than what you've decided you should be. The emptiness that appears when you stop pretending is not a problem to solve by finding your true self. It's a feature. It's the space that allows you to be different, to be responsive, to be alive and changing rather than fixed and performed. But our culture doesn't like this. Our culture wants consistent, predictable, definable identities. It wants you to be a brand, to have a clear value proposition, to be the same person in all contexts so others know what to expect from you. And this pressure to be consistent, to be predictable, to be definable, this is what creates the need to perform in the first place. Because you're not actually consistent. You're not actually predictable. You're not actually definable. You're a complex, flowing, ever-changing process that's influenced by context and mood and energy and 1,000 other factors. But admitting this feels dangerous. Feels like you don't know who you are. Feels like you're unstable or unreliable or fake. So you perform consistency. You perform a stable identity. You perform being definable. And this performance is the pretending. And when you stop pretending, the emptiness is just the space where that false consistency used to be. Let me tell you about what fills the emptiness authentically. It's not a new set of traits. It's not a clear identity. It's not a better character. What fills the emptiness is presence. Moment-to-moment awareness of what's actually true in your experience right now. You're in a conversation and someone says something that doesn't sit right with you. In the past, when you were performing, you might have let it go, agreed, moved on. But now, without the performance, you notice the not sitting right feeling. You might not know what to do with it yet. You might not even know why it doesn't sit right, but you notice it. You feel it. You acknowledge it. This noticing, this feeling, this acknowledging, this is what fills the emptiness. Not with a decision about who you are, but with presence to what's happening, with actual contact with your actual experience. You're making a decision about how to spend your weekend. In the past, when you were performing, you might have chosen the option that looked best, that you could post about, that fit your image. But now, without the performance, you check in with what you actually want. And maybe what you actually want is not impressive. Maybe it's staying home in your pajamas. Maybe it's something that doesn't make a good story, but it's what's true. And choosing based on what's true rather than what looks good, this is what fills the emptiness. You're in a moment of difficulty and someone asks how you are. In the past, when you were performing, you had a script. I'm fine. I'm great. Couldn't be better. But now, without the performance, you check in with how you actually are. And maybe the answer is complicated. Maybe you're both okay and not okay. Maybe you're struggling but also handling it. Maybe you don't have a neat summary. And saying something true instead of something scripted, this is what fills the emptiness. These moments accumulate. These small choices to be present, to notice what's true, to respond authentically rather than perform appropriately, they build on each other. And gradually, the emptiness becomes less empty. Not because you filled it with a new identity, but because you filled it with presence, with awareness, with actual living rather than performed living. And here's what's interesting. As you do this, as you live from presence rather than performance, you start to develop a sense of yourself that's more solid than anything the performance ever provided. Not because you've defined yourself clearly, but because you're in actual contact with yourself. You know yourself not as a concept, but as a lived experience. You know how you respond to different situations, not because you've decided how you should respond, but because you've observed how you actually do respond. You know your preferences, not because you've adopted certain preferences as part of your identity, but because you've noticed what you're actually drawn to and what you're actually repelled by. You know your values, not because you've selected impressive-sounding values, but because you've paid attention to what you actually care about in practice. This knowing is deeper than the performed certainty ever was. The performed certainty was shallow, it was just a script. But this knowing is embodied. It's real. It comes from actual experience of yourself rather than from a constructed narrative about yourself. And paradoxically, this deeper knowing is also more flexible. Because it's based on observation rather than decision, it can change when your actual experience changes. You don't have to defend it or maintain it or prove it's consistent. You can just notice, oh, that's different now, and adjust accordingly. The performed identity had to be defended. Any evidence that contradicted it had to be dismissed or explained away. Any inconsistency was a threat. But this present-based knowing doesn't require defense. If you were confident yesterday and uncertain today, that's just what's true. If you wanted connection last week and solitude this week, that's just how it is. There's no threat because there's no fixed identity that needs protecting. This is what living without pretending actually feels like. Once you've moved through the initial emptiness, it's not arriving at a clearer, truer, better identity. It's releasing the need for a fixed identity altogether. It's being willing to be different, to contradict yourself, to not know, to change your mind, to be messy and complex and alive rather than neat and consistent and performed. Let me tell you about the loneliness that comes with this. Because when you stop pretending, you become harder to know. Not because you're hiding, but because you're not presenting a clear, consistent, easily graspable identity. You're being present and responsive and changing, and this is harder for others to get a handle on. People liked the performed version of you because it was predictable. They knew what to expect. They knew who you were. They could file you in a category and feel comfortable with their understanding of you. But this new way of being, this presence-based authenticity, it's slipperier. You're different in different contexts. You're responsive to different situations. You're not always the same person. And this makes people uncomfortable. They'll say you've changed. They'll tell you they don't know who you are anymore. They'll express concern or confusion or frustration. And they're not wrong. You have changed. You're not who they thought you were. Because who they thought you were was the performed version, and that version is gone. So there's loneliness in this. The loneliness of being real in a world that prefers performances. The loneliness of being complex in a culture that demands simplicity. The loneliness of being changing in a context that values consistency. But there's also freedom. The freedom of not having to maintain the performance. The freedom of being able to show up differently in different moments. The freedom of not being trapped in an identity you've outgrown. The freedom of being actually alive rather than carefully maintained. And if you can tolerate the loneliness, if you can accept that being real means being less easily knowable, you might find something unexpected. You might find that the people who stick around, the people who can handle your complexity and changeability and presence-based way of being, these people connect with you more deeply than anyone ever connected with the performed version. Because they're connecting with something real, something alive, something that's actually you in the moment rather than a carefully maintained presentation. And this kind of connection, rare as it is worth all the loneliness that comes from no longer being easily knowable. Let me tell you about what you discover in the emptiness. You discover that you're not who you thought you were. Not better, not worse, just different. More complex, more contradictory, more human. You discover that the things you thought were core to your identity were often just parts of the performance. The confidence, the strength, the independence, the success, these were characters you were playing, not essential truths about who you are. You discover that who you actually are is much more ambiguous. You're confident sometimes and uncertain other times. You're strong in some ways and vulnerable in others. You're independent about some things and deeply needful about others. You're successful by some measures and struggling by others. You discover that your preferences are more particular than you realized. You don't just like music, you like specific sounds in specific moods. You don't just enjoy people, you enjoy certain people in certain contexts at certain times. You don't just want success, you want specific experiences of accomplishment that align with specific values. You discover that you have needs you've been ignoring. Physical needs, emotional needs, relational needs, spiritual needs. Needs that didn't fit into the performance, so they got suppressed, denied, overridden. And now that you're not pretending, these needs become visible. They demand attention. They insist on being acknowledged. You discover that you're more sensitive than you admitted, more affected by things, more impacted by others' moods, more influenced by your environment. The performance required you to be tough, unaffected, unbothered, but without the performance, you feel things, a lot of things, maybe too many things, and you have to figure out how to honor this sensitivity without being overwhelmed by it. You discover that you're lonelier than you realized. The performance created connection, but it was connection with the character, not with you. And now that the character is gone, you see how little genuine connection you actually have, how few people know you, how many relationships were built on the pretending. You discover that you're more afraid than you acknowledged, afraid of rejection, of failure, of being too much or not enough. The performance covered these fears, projected confidence and certainty. But without it, the fears are visible. They need to be felt, worked with, integrated rather than hidden. These discoveries are uncomfortable. They don't match the image you had of yourself. They don't align with the story you were telling. They're messy and complicated and sometimes unflattering. But they're true. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, is better than comfortable fiction. Because here's what you also discover in the emptiness. You discover that you're more resilient than you thought. You've survived the collapse of the performed identity. You've tolerated the emptiness. You've sat with not knowing. And you're okay. Not perfect, not always comfortable, but okay. You discover that you're more capable than the performance suggested. Because the performance had specific capabilities. It knew how to be impressive, how to look good, how to get approval. But you, the real you, emerging in the emptiness, you have different capabilities. You can be present. You can notice what's true. You can adjust to reality rather than trying to control it. You can be with uncertainty rather than requiring certainty. These are deeper capabilities than the performance ever had. You discover that you're more interesting than the performed version. Not interesting in the sense of impressive or admirable, but interesting in the sense of complex, nuanced, alive. The performance was one-dimensional. It had to be consistent. But you're multidimensional. You contain contradictions, complexities, depths that the performance could never capture. And most importantly, you discover that you can exist without the performance. That you're not nothing without it. That the emptiness was temporary. A transition. A space for discovering what's actually there when you're not pretending. And what's actually there is you. Messy, complicated, ever-changing you. And that's enough. This is the strange emptiness that appears when you stop pretending. It's not permanent. It's not a void. It's a clearing, a space for something real to emerge, a gap between who you were pretending to be and who you're discovering you actually are. And if you can tolerate it, if you can sit in it without rushing to fill it with another performance, if you can be with the not knowing long enough to let real knowing emerge, you'll discover something worth all the discomfort. You'll discover that being real, even when it's empty, even when it's confusing, even when it's uncertain, is better than pretending ever was. Because at least you're here. At least you're present. At least you're alive in your actual life rather than performing an imagined one. And that strange and empty, as it might feel at first, is worth everything.